At 80 years old, she stood barefoot on a freezing sidewalk at 3 in the morning, watching 42 years of her life disappear into flames. By sunrise, everything she owned fit into a single plastic bag. But what happened in the next 72 hours didn't just change her life, it sparked a movement that reached millions of people across the globe. And it started with something so small, most people would have missed it entirely. The fire started just after 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. She woke up to smoke, not the faint smell of something burning, thick, choking smoke that made her eyes water before she even opened them. Her smoke alarm was screaming. The hallway was already glowing orange. She had maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds to grab a lifetime of memories. 90 seconds to decide what mattered. And in that moment of pure panic, her hand reached for the nightstand and grabbed the only thing she could find, a small, half-filled notebook. Then she ran. By the time she stumbled onto the sidewalk, coughing and shaking, her neighbors were already outside. Someone wrapped a coat around her shoulders. Someone else called 911. But all she could do was stand there, barefoot on the cold concrete, watching the only home she'd known for 4 decades burn. The house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was the kitchen table where she'd served breakfast to her kids every morning for 18 years. It was the windowsill lined with potted plants she talked to like old friends. It was a hallway covered in photographs, birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, the faces of people who existed now only in memory. Every drawer held a story. Every scratch in the floor had a reason. And in a single night, all of it was gone. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. By mid-morning, the street looked almost normal again. Fire trucks packed up and left. Neighbors went to work. Traffic hummed along like nothing had happened. The world had moved on. But she had nowhere to go. The Red Cross shelter was kind, but it was overwhelming. Fluorescent lights stayed on all night, cots lined up against the walls, people crying softly when they thought no one was listening, families staring at cell phones, scrolling through photos of homes that no longer existed. She folded her donated sweater neatly at the edge of her cot each morning, as if keeping order could somehow hold back the chaos pressing in around her. For the first time in 80 years, she didn't know what tomorrow looked like. There were forms to fill out, numbers to call, offices to visit where people in tired voices explained processes she didn't understand. Insurance adjusters, FEMA representatives, housing assistants, coordinators. Each task felt like climbing a mountain that grew steeper with every step. She apologized constantly to volunteers, to caseworkers, to the young woman who handed her a toothbrush and a bar of soap. She felt like a burden, like a problem that needed solving, like she was taking up space meant for someone more important. But on the third day, something changed. She was sitting at a long plastic table with a paper cup of coffee, too weak, too cold, when she noticed a little boy 2 seats down. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He clutched a stuffed rabbit with one arm and his mother's sleeve with the other, his eyes wide and restless, searching the room like he expected something else to disappear at any moment. She recognized that look immediately. It was fear, the kind that sits quietly in your chest and makes the whole world feel too big. Now, what happened next is the part that nobody saw coming. She reached into that plastic bag, the one that now held everything she owned in the world, and pulled out the notebook she'd grabbed from her nightstand. The pages were slightly curled at the edges, singed around the corners, but still mostly blank. That afternoon, she started writing. Not a journal, not a memoir, something different. She wrote tiny notes, simple ones, things like, "You're stronger than you know," and "This feeling won't last forever," and "Someone sees you." She wrote reminders to breathe, little drawings of flowers, words she'd once said to her own children when they were scared and the future felt uncertain. Then she did something that seemed almost crazy for someone who'd lost everything. She started leaving the notes around the shelter, on tables, beside the coffee urns, tucked next to juice boxes in the kids' area, slipped quietly into the hands of people staring at the floor. She had lost her home, her possessions, her sense of safety, but she hadn't lost the part of herself that knew how to show up for other people. At first, nobody knew who was leaving them. People would find these little folded notes and look around, confused, touched, sometimes crying. The volunteers started noticing them too. One volunteer, a woman named Jasmine, who'd been working 16-hour shifts, found one that said, "Your kindness is changing lives. Please don't forget to rest." Jasmine kept that note in her pocket for 3 months. But here's where it gets absolutely incredible. Someone took a photo of one of the notes and posted it online. Just a simple caption. "This was waiting next to the coffee this morning," from an 80-year-old woman who lost everything in a fire 3 days ago. Within 24 hours, that post had 40,000 shares. By the end of the week, it had reached millions. News stations called, radio shows wanted interviews. But when reporters showed up expecting to find a tragic story about an elderly woman who'd lost everything, they found something completely different. They found someone who wanted to talk about the little boy with the stuffed rabbit, about Jasmine and the other exhausted volunteers, about the way people needed reminders that someone still saw them even in their darkest moments. The messages started pouring in, from Seattle, from Atlanta, from a hospital in rural Montana and a school in downtown Chicago. Strangers mailed her notebooks, hundreds of them, pens, stamps, stationery covered in flowers and mountains and quotes about resilience. Children sent drawings for her to hand out. Teachers asked if they could share her notes with students who were struggling. Nurses printed them out and taped them inside hospital break rooms. A firefighter in Boston said he kept one in his helmet. Her words were traveling farther than she'd ever traveled in her entire life. But the media kept asking about the fire, about what she'd lost, about the house and the memories and the photographs that were now just ash. And every single time she redirected the conversation, because she discovered something that the fire couldn't touch. The donations came. Of course they did. People sent money, tens of thousands of dollars eventually, enough to start over, enough to rebuild. But you know what she held on to most tightly? The letters. Thousands of them, handwritten, typed, scribbled on notebook paper by kids who could barely write. Stories from people who said her small notes had arrived on the exact day they'd almost given up, on the day they'd been fired, the day they'd gotten a terrible diagnosis, the day they'd felt so alone they couldn't see a way forward. One letter came from a veteran in Phoenix who'd been struggling with PTSD for 8 years. He'd found one of her notes, a printout someone had left at his VA clinic on the morning he decided to end his life. It said, "The world is better with you in it." He wrote to tell her he was still here. There was a high school teacher in Detroit who'd been photocopying the notes and putting them in her students' lockers, a hospice nurse who'd read them to patients in their final days, a prison chaplain who'd started a program teaching inmates to write encouraging notes for each other, inspired by her example. The thing is, she never set out to inspire millions. She just saw a scared little boy and remembered what it felt like to be afraid. She just had a notebook and a choice, and she chose to show up. 8 months later, there was a ceremony. A local construction company had volunteered to build her a new house. Architects donated their time. Suppliers provided materials at cost. Volunteers showed up on weekends, hundreds of them, people who'd never met her but felt like they knew her through her words. The house was small, simple, not fancy, but it was hers. The day they handed her the keys, news cameras were there. So were some of the people whose lives she'd touched. Jasmine, the shelter volunteer, came. So did the mother of the little boy with the stuffed rabbit. Someone asked her how it felt to have a home again. She looked at the crowd, at the faces of strangers who'd become friends, at the people holding signs with her own words written on them, and she said something that nobody expected. "I never lost my home. I just learned where it really was." She still carries a notebook in her purse every single day. She still writes notes and leaves them in coffee shops, libraries, grocery stores, hospital waiting rooms. She's written over 12,000 of them now. But she's not alone anymore. The movement she accidentally started has spread to 47 countries. There are Facebook groups where people share photos of notes they've found or written. Schools have started Note Day programs. Companies have created encouragement walls in their break rooms. All because an 80-year-old woman stood on a sidewalk with nothing and chose to give anyway. Here's the thing that nobody tells you about losing everything. It's terrifying. It's disorienting. It strips away every false sense of security you've ever had. But it also reveals something essential. It shows you what remains when everything else is gone. For her, what remained was the part of herself that showed up for other people, the part that noticed a scared child and reached out, the part that believed words could matter, even when they came from someone who society had written off as powerless. She had watched her life burn down in a single night. She had stood on a sidewalk with nothing but smoke behind her and uncertainty ahead. But from that small, steady light, the one that couldn't be extinguished by any fire, a new life began to grow. Not just for her, for millions. The next time you're walking through your darkest moment, remember this. You are not defined by what you've lost. You're defined by what you choose to do with what remains. And sometimes what remains is exactly enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us about a time someone's small act of kindness changed your life. And remember, you never know when your words might be exactly what someone needs to keep going. Because sometimes the smallest light shines the brightest in the darkest night.